Well, let's hear from both sides of this argument. Emma Revel is from the Institute of Economic Affairs and Alfie Stirling is from the New Economics Foundation. Alfie, welcome to the show. What choice does the Chancellor have with record borrowing other than to inflict this pay freeze on the public sector?
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me on. I think the first point there in terms of public sector debt and high borrowing is that we've got to make sure we're measuring the right thing here. Debt is high, but the interest cost, the cost of government borrowing, is at record lows. This October, we borrowed 4 billion less than last October, and that's because interest rates are down, inflation is down, and it's never been better for covering our finances. Now, on public sector pay...
Alfie, why are voices of the left so relaxed about borrowing? Because I can assure you, my many thousands of listeners are extremely worried when they find themselves paying bills via credit cards and an overdraft. And that is frankly what's happening at the moment in this country. Borrowing has now reached over 100% of GDP. Over 2 trillion is currently where the national debt stands. I don't think we should be so cavalier about this borrowing.
I'm afraid it's not a left-wing position at all, actually. It's mainstream economics, and it does take more than owning a credit card to understand macroeconomics. And your analogy there just doesn't hold up for how the economy works. The macroeconomy is incredibly complex. If you have people unemployed, you want to get them back into work so they're paying their taxes, and more importantly, they're buying goods and services and creating other jobs for other people. And this comes back to the public sector pay question, actually, because I think there's a really important moral question here, which is key workers. We've come to realise how valuable key workers are to our society during this pandemic. And actually, this is the wrong time morally to be saying, no, hold back. But actually, possibly more importantly than that, even from the point of view of economics, is this is a big false economy. Number one, if you cut back public sector pay, you have issues of retention, morale, the resilience of public services, and that comes back as a cost to the exchequer.
I think with spiralling unemployment, I don't think retention is going to be a problem for the next few years.
But this is then the interesting thing about the other false economy. If you cut back public sector pay, that means more lost private sector jobs. Private sector jobs are contingent on spending in the economy. It needs you, it needs me, it needs Emma to spend our money, our pay packets in the economy, and that includes public sector workers. And if you cut back their pay, you lose private sector jobs as well.
Now, Alfie, I think that the public sector have drawn the short straw after a decade of austerity. I think that it is the right thing to do to pay our treasured world-class public sector workers properly. And at the moment, we do not. My argument is not the principle of a pay rise, it's the timing.
But I think that goes back to the economics. Now is the time to maintain spending in the economy. Government can afford to do that because costs of borrowing are at record low. In fact, if it doesn't do it, we'll see higher unemployment and more jobs lost and lower tax receipts in the future. So it's a false economy not to borrow. And it's, by the way, that's, again, don't have to believe me on this. The chief economists of the IMF, who were one of the key proponents of austerity initially, have come full circle on this and said fiscal responsibility is fiscal stimulus. So I think it's the false economy here that is the key thing on the timing. And that is why now is not the time to be cutting back spending in the economy with public sector pay cuts. And actually, we need to be boosting spending to protect those jobs in the private sector as well.
Emma Revel, Institute of Economic Affairs. Alfie spoke very well there, as he always does on this programme, and I'm praying he's right. But this level of national indebtedness keeps me awake at night.
Yes, and it should probably keep everyone awake at night. I think it's important to remember that a 1% increase in public sector pay costs £2 billion. So, this is money that has to come from somewhere. And at a time when the private sector, which is 85% of the economy, I think, is being decimated, people's jobs are at risk. People are working fewer hours. They're not as secure in their future. Tax revenue is going to fall if unemployment increases. The money simply isn't there. So I think the idea of a pay increase for public sector workers at this time is the wrong time to be asking, because we can't afford it.
What about the moral argument that we have asked so much of the public sector in the last few months? The least we can do is thank them with a proper remuneration package.
Well, I don't think people's pay should be determined on a moral judgment. I don't think that just because someone works in the public sector, that necessarily means they're more deserving of someone, for example, who works in a supermarket. Supermarkets have been, one of the champions of the pandemic. They have kept, everyone taking over. It's pretty much one of the few sectors that hasn't had any kind of lockdown, any kind of closure. They have been open pretty much every hour God sends since the 23rd of March, when we entered into the first lockdown. I would like to reward those people who work in Tesco as much as people working in the public sector. But if the money isn't there, the money simply isn't there.
Alfie, in relation to this borrowing, you're absolutely right, of course, that at the moment, we're borrowing at a cost of almost zero, and Britain is still, a bankable investment in the kind of global bond markets, and long may that continue. Obviously, that's not a limitless, available flow of funding that could come our way. But in relation to where that borrowed money goes, surely the priority at this moment in time is job creation, not paying those that currently have work.
I think that's right. I think there are probably three priorities at the moment: job creation, income protection, and job protection as well. All three of those are crucial. And I think public sector pay is one plank in that strategy. Again, as I said before, if you are cutting public sector pay, you are costing jobs somewhere else as well. The private sector needs spending in the economy. So it's partly about the moral argument and about also the false economy in terms of strong public services, but it's also about preserving jobs in the private sector as well. I don't like actually this kind of dichotomy of public versus private. The two rely on each other. And I wanted to put this big picture point another way as well, in terms of why it's right now to be borrowing, and forget the economics, forget the macro and the complexity. If we were 9 months into World War II, left or right, do you think people would be saying, okay, right, we can't afford it now, let's cut back on everything? I know we're not at the end of this thing, but that's it, there's no money left? Of course not. They didn't know how long it was going to be going on for. There was a bigger goal, a bigger objective outside of the level of public borrowing, and we kept going. And actually borrowing and debt in public sector went up to 250% of GDP. Was that a ceiling? Did it cause a crisis in the economy? No, it didn't. And it was gradually paid back through growth, through private sector growth and incomes that were supported by that public sector spending at that crucial moment in time. And I would say that the current moment is highly analogous to that.
Most public sector workers rightly enjoy a number of protections and privileges, including sick pay, holiday pay, pensions, of course, and ultimately, in most cases, a job for life. So surely that's enough in the context of many, many of our listeners to this program who have seen their businesses collapse and have seen themselves jobless. In relation to where priorities lie, surely that one is clear.
I mean, I think I would use the government's phrase, I want to level up, not level down. I think the standards of work should be far, far higher in the private sector. I think pay should be higher. I think security should be higher. But also, I think that you've got to be careful with these comparisons as well, because if you compare like for like public sector with private sector, and what I mean by that is, similar place in the country, similar age, similar level of experience, actually the public sector is paid less. It's about 6-7% less on average when you compare like for like. But as I say, comparisons aside, it's about both. It's about levelling up private sector standards, and part of that is making sure there's spending in the economy to support those jobs.
I mean, ultimately, though, this is Keynesian economics on acid, isn't it? This is just giving people money, Alfie. That we can all agree the public sector should have a pay rise, that they have suffered as a result of austerity, which was a debatable economic idea in the first place. But we are where we are. The country is indebted. The available debt is not limitless. Ask Greece. Once the international bond markets get suspicious about where the lent money is going, they will raise the cost of borrowing. And it's not impossible that could happen to Britain. No country is too big to fail. And therefore, if you think about investing money rather than just handing cash out to people, perhaps it is in infrastructure and investing in new jobs and getting the people who are on the dole queue back into work.
Well, I think the comparison with Greece isn't really valid. Greece didn't have its own currency as part of a monetary union, and that meant it was in a straitjacket in terms of the bond markets. In the UK, there's two things to bear in mind.
I think there were a few more problems in Greece than their currency.
Yeah, and many of those the UK also doesn't share, which makes the comparison, I think, a bit difficult. But for one big point is that we've got an independent central bank, the Bank of England, and what they've been doing at the moment is intervening in the bond market precisely to ensure government can borrow for things that are crucial for the economy, like strong public services. So, a few weeks ago, Andrew Bailey announced £150 billion of quantitative easing. That's buying up government debt on the bond market. It's showing there is always a borrower of last resort. And that's why our borrowing costs are so low. In Greece, that's far more challenging in a monetary union. Or at least it was back in the early days of 2010. But the UK doesn't have that problem. But one other small point on this, the point at which bond markets tend to move away from government debt is when there's something else better for them to invest in. And actually, that's a good thing. The point at which there's something better shows the economy is recovering. So the interesting thing about all this is we want bond market interest rates to start rising and for investors to go for other parts of the economy, but we can't get there if we keep cutting back public sector pay, costing private sector jobs, and not keeping the economy moving.
Final word to Emma Revel.
Look, the government deficit for this year is going to be £400,000 billion. The debt is well over 100% of income, and at the end of the day, the government doesn't have money of its own. The government has taxpayers' money. And at a time when the private sector, most people who work in the private sector, even if they've had a fairly comfortable time on furlough, that doesn't mean their job is guaranteed. Jobs will be at risk, jobs will be lost, and that means that the amount of revenue the government has available to spend will be limited at a time when we're going to have to cover the cost of all of the other things that Rishi Sunak is doing, including paying back the money for the furlough scheme. And I think it's all well and good to say that interest rates are low now, but they're not going to be low forever, and this money will need paying back. So I think if one of these steps that needs to be taken is a freeze in public sector pay, in the hope that perhaps in a year the freeze will be lifted, I think that's a reasonable step to take at this stage.
A very balanced and constructive debate. My sincere thanks to Alfie Stirling from the New Economics Foundation and Emma Revel from the Institute of Economic Affairs.